Hello, today's video is 10 true scary stories while camping. Before the video starts, I would like to thank Fear Crawler and Swamp Dweller for helping me out on this. If you aren't already subscribed to them, their channel links will be in the description. Please go check them out after the video. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forests, some great state parks, and tons of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of the people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of it online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you from your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay here too long, without anything else going for you, at least. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only other employment in the area is Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and a lot of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog. It's about a 10-minute drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat up $500 cars just barreling along the roads meant for 4x4s. Some of the people you see in these cars look like the guy that got crushed by the ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to play paintball in the national forest. Probably illegal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep looking, so we drove about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it was getting pretty dark, and we were getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We had all our GPS and smartphones on us, but none of us had service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service Rangers used a backhoe to block off this road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier laid in the woods nearby. It looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over this mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had a pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down the road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kinda odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck running and set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding this site. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at this time, and I just thought that someone had been dumping their garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in this area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m., and we were eating, and we noticed a faint glow from the other side of the nearby hill. At first we thought it was the moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make much sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. Since there was no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was a quarter-mile from our campsite, so we decided to investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know we wouldn't have done so. However, We all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay and pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been a work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock off bark in a circle. Jacob and I start talking about a ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided maybe we didn't need to see where the light was coming from. We walked back in silence and kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlights and just use the moonlight to get back to our campsite. When we get a couple 100 feet from our campsite, I could see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wear before. For some reason, he was carrying a paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see the campsite very well at all. At this point, we probably had been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and peering into the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander into the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. We go to check the truck, enter the door code, and see our paintball equipment just where we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in the magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Just change your jackets?" Isaac said he had been in a tent since we left, that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone was walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us were too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to the house for the night. We didn't bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump into the F-150 and start to drive out. When we get back to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that was laying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wants to go out of the car and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of my F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have just been balanced on top, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As soon as we drove down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off of it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past the metal barrier since that time, but it always seems to be in place. I would never go down that road again though.
I've posted this before as a reply to a comment. It's been playing on my mind because last week it came up in my time hop, and then I thought I'd post it here. So last summer I booked a glamping trip to the next county over. The website looked beautiful. a campsite of 6 large yurts outside a lovely little village. Coincidentally, I had driven through that village before, as it's close to a really nice historic castle I like to visit occasionally. So we pay our money, and my husband, 2 kids, and I pitch up. It's one of the last weekends of the summer, and it was lovely weather. The campsite was on a small hill, and the people who owned it lived on top of the hill in their farmhouse. We were checking in on a Sunday for 2 nights, as we were first shift workers at the time. We passed other people checking out, and they all looked happy. The owners of the site showed us down to our yurt, and mentioned that we were the only ones on site for our stay this time, it being a Sunday. We were happy with that, to be honest, because with 2 young kids, it meant they could make noise if they wanted, and we wouldn't disturb anybody. When she showed us around, she did say that the yurt door didn't lock. None of them did, which was fine because you don't lock a tent, right? The place was in its own mini wooded area, and it was absolutely beautiful. The owner also mentioned the kids would be safe to wander because they had perimeter fences because of their dogs. The first night was fun. We had a barbecue, the kids played, and we went down to sleep at about 8. I found it hard to sleep, but I often do somewhere new. There was only patchy phone coverage, so we read until we fell asleep. Next morning, my husband seems a bit out of sorts, but I asked him if he was all right, and he was all, "Yep, fine." So I left it. We went out for the day and had a great time. The whole day was blazing hot, and then we got back. I was washing up after dinner and the kids were playing, when a shadow came over the whole place. I felt eyes on me, and it went really cold. Honestly, it felt like something bad was going to happen. I felt dread hit me. We'd already paid to stay, but I pulled my husband to the side and said, "We have to leave right now. I don't know why. I've just got a bad feeling. Please, let's just go home." Normally he'd try to talk me out of something like this, but he didn't. He started getting the kids together and I packed our stuff. We went to the farmhouse where the couple who owned it sat outside playing with their dogs. My husband started loading up the car, while I apologized to them and explained we needed to leave because our youngest was feeling ill. They said how sorry they were about it, and then just as I turned to leave, the male owner asked if my husband had been outside the house last night, about 3 or 4 in the morning. I said no, he hadn't left my side all night. I would have woken. He asked me if I was sure. By this point, my husband was by my side and answered that no, he hadn't. "Why?" "Well," says the guy, "the security lights came on and the dog started barking, and when we looked outside, there was a man wandering around, who then turned around and walked back down in the direction of the yurts. They assumed it was my husband. We both said it wasn't, and said our goodbyes quickly. I tore out of that place in the car, and then about a quarter mile down the road, my husband turned to me and said, 'You're right. I was quiet this morning. I didn't say anything. I wanted to use the bathroom in the wee hours, but as I was about to get up, I heard footsteps on the decking outside. Not hooves or something on 4 legs. Something on 2 legs. I lay there quiet as possible and hoped the kids wouldn't wake up or something. Nope. It still freaks me out now." Summer of 97. I was 9 and scared of my own shadow, so this experience only furthered my fear of the world. My mom and I drove from Revere, Massachusetts to Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire to camp. My dad was going to drive up the next morning to meet us because he had work. So everything was going normal at the campsite. We set up the tent, built our fire, and all was well. It was still daylight when we noticed that the lone greasy-haired man in the campsite connected to ours was continually running and leaping onto a wooden post, then attempting to balance himself on one foot. He kept doing this over and over again. It was odd, but we just figured he was some lonely kook and had a good laugh at his expense. My mom thought maybe he was trying out for the circus. Cut to nighttime. Absolute darkness if not for the campfire. My mom and I were sitting and roasting s'mores over the flames when we heard footsteps approaching from the other campsite. Out of the pines, the lone man stumbled onto our sight, and he was ghastly and ragged in the firelight. I could tell my mom was tense. She asked the stranger what he needed.
"Hey,"
he mumbled.
"I need your help with my campsite."
We waited, and he didn't go on. My mom asked what he needed help with. The filthy man said,
"I locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over and help me."
He then looked at me and said,
"Don't worry, kid. You can stay here with your fire."
I remember getting goosebumps at that. My mom said, "I don't know how I can help you with your keys,"
"You must have a spare hanger lying around somewhere,"
suggested the man. My mom told him she didn't. The ghoulish man wouldn't let up, though.
"Yeah? You must have a hanger lying around here somewhere. Maybe you dropped one on the ground near your tent."
My mom adamantly told him she didn't have a hanger, and quickly added, "My husband will be here soon. Maybe he can help you. He's a pretty strong guy."
"Yeah. All right,"
the creep slurred, and he started to trudge away into the dark. But then he turned his head and said,
"Well, if you do find a hanger, come help me. I'll be here."
And with that, the horrible man left. My mom and I barely slept that night. I felt her moving at every sound outside the tent. Looking back, my poor mother must have stayed up through that long night, worrying that a butcher knife was going to slash through the tent wall. And so, morning eventually came, and when we stepped out of the tent, we immediately saw that the lone man and his camper van were gone. Later in the day, I heard my mom shouting. I ran over to her and watched as she picked something up from the ground beside our tent. She held it between us, staring at it, not speaking. It was a metal hanger.
In 2007, I was a freshman going on sophomore in college, and my brother, Martin, was still in high school. We have two much younger siblings, so at the time, they were around elementary school age. My parents decided to take a cruise for their 20th wedding anniversary that year, so my brother and I were voluntold to watch my younger brother and sister, Cole and Charlotte. My brother's best friend, Christian, stayed with us while my parents were gone and helped us plan fun activities with the younger siblings. One idea they were particularly excited about was a camping trip, as my family had never been particularly outdoorsy in the past. Their eyes lit up at the prospect of cooking our dinner over a campfire and fishing in the stream. Since it was early summertime, we had the great luck of warm but not too hot weather and a beautiful clear sky for stargazing. Finally packed and ready for the somewhat long drive to the mountains, we checked into our campsite before dark. Cole and Charlotte helped us set up the tent. It was strange, but there were no other people at the campground, which was unusual for this time of year. Once we finished dinner, the young brother and sister were ready for sleep, so Martin, Christian, and I stayed awake a little longer, catching up and getting these things ready for the next morning. Suddenly, a white Astro van pulled up in the camping spot directly next to ours. He had dozens to choose from, but chose to park right next to us. "Oh well," Christian said, "at least we have company now." He called out a quick, "Hello," to the new neighbor, with no response back. I got an uneasy feeling almost immediately and decided to push it aside and continue to get the fishing poles ready for the morning and put the food away for the night to ward off bears and wild animals. Over the next hour or so, things started to get weird. The man parked next to us got out of his van and sat at a picnic table only with a small fire. From our roaring fire, I could see that he was looking directly at us. However, this fire died out completely several minutes later and he just continued sitting there. I could feel him staring, but I couldn't see his face anymore. He was just sitting there, breathing. Christian and Martin noticed that I was uneasy, and they picked up on how creepy the situation started to become. Martin whispered, "Why is he breathing like that? I don't feel safe anymore." I told Christian and Martin that I was going to stay awake because I didn't trust this guy. As soon as they moved from the fire into their tents, the man rose from the picnic table and started moving toward us. I called out, "Hello?" with no response from him. Finally, in a whim of panic, I demanded that we pack up and get the heck out of there and get home immediately. Christian and Martin got out of their tents and saw the figure of the man just standing there, staring at us, breathing hard. We tried to stay as quiet and calm as possible while we packed up, not to alarm Cole and Charlotte. Finally, throwing everything in the trunk, we drove away, not looking back. Before leaving the site itself, I asked if we could go to the check-in area at the lodge to see what the hell was going on and see if they knew anything more. What was this guy's deal? But to my surprise, there was no one else registered at the campsite that evening. The story doesn't end there, though. Roughly about 6 months later, when a local hiker went missing in a county over from where we camped and where I went to college. She was doing something so normal, hiking with her dog. Sadly, she turned up several months later murdered and found in a white Astro van. When the news finally released photos of the van and the man's face, I knew it was him. I got a phone call from both my brother and his friend, and they recognized him too. We came to find out that this wasn't the first murder that he had done. He had become known as the National Forest serial killer. I sincerely mean it when I say I'm an incredibly cautious camper now because of this encounter. Thinking that it could have been us or my younger siblings, it still gives me nightmares to this day. We recently had a reunion, Christian, Martin, and I, and we talked about what happened to us more than 10 years ago. It's amazing though. We all remember the details as they are etched in our memories forever. I went on a camping trip with my 2 kids at a public campground over the summer. Unfortunately, my husband was unable to be with us due to work. The first night we were swimming in the pool because it was so hot. It was around 100 degrees and the tent was unbearable. After some time though, 3 older couples came into the pool, and I thought it was best for us to move on. Later that evening, one of my kids and I were at a table in our campsite when I spot one of the men from the pool walking towards us. He asked me what part of the state we were from. I figured he had read my license plate. I told him we're from the east side. He then comments that he had worked there before. Didn't feel off about him, but I am cautious and giving short answers in hopes he realized I didn't want to talk anymore. I am camping alone with kids after all. I asked if he is a camper. He says he lives here and works here. Many of the slots are permanent renters. The next morning I am cooking breakfast in this little 3-sided kitchen for the tent campers with my youngest 6-year-old child. The 4th side was a waist-high flower box with only a 3-foot entrance into the kitchen. This man approaches me again. Because of the kitchen setup, I feel trapped. I do not want to interact with this man, and I am not okay with this setup. Here is our conversation. Good morning. Good morning. It's not normal for a woman and her kids to be left alone at a camp. Well, another kid had an activity and they were unavailable. Divide and conquer, I guess. Yeah, I understand that. And besides, I'm a better shot than my husband. Okay, have a good day. I nod as he walks away, and didn't see him after that, thankfully.
Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature preserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the name. It was pretty primitive camping, no cell service, and we only saw 2 other people there in the entire place. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked off the trail and the hood open. I don't really notice these type of things, but my boyfriend said it looked to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off beside her to offer her help with the truck. Normally my boyfriend is the type to at least offer to call someone, but he said she skeeved him out enough that he didn't want to draw her attention more than what was necessary. The next person we saw drove by several times while we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice this though, until my boyfriend pointed out that he had already drove by twice. Whether these two people had any sinister going on or not, the real story has to do with what woke us up around 3 a.m. It was incredibly loud all of a sudden. I couldn't describe it, even compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using a large tool to scrape the gravel. My boyfriend jumped up and looked out the window of the tent. The sound happened again, and again, and again. It was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later my boyfriend told me that because he didn't want me to be scared. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to dart off to the car was because he was afraid it could be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered. I should have noticed that he was whispering and knew something was wrong, since otherwise he would speak normally, right? Because every little sound I heard outside sounded like someone was sneaking up on the tent. Eventually my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. We held our only weapon, a machete, in front of us. It was a full moon, or close to it, so we didn't need a light. While we were packing up quickly, I noticed the empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we went to sleep around 10 p.m., and neither of us even brought any to drink. Thankfully, we got out of there, and for the rest of the trip, we either camped in areas that were well populated by other campers, or we got a hotel room. So whoever or whatever that was, let's not meet. When I shared my previous camping story on here, I was reminded of another unsettling experience I had, which also took place at a campground. This time I was with my father, but I was young and oblivious to what was going on. My father used to enjoy to go to this campground not far from his hometown he grew up in. The campground was in Vermont and was called Captain Place. He enjoyed how peaceful and remote this area was. Having been there a few times and observing that it was just family friendly, he thought it would be a nice place to bring his daughter with him, choosing to go around the same time of year that he went the last few times. There was a campsite of 3 men who were out-of-staters in their 40s. Most likely were from Boston because of their accent. They had a big fancy trailer, and the entire site was decked out with a dartboard, hammock, lawn chairs, garden gnomes, and fake patches of grass. From observation, it looks like they stayed there a couple weeks at a time. All settled in, quite comfortable, too comfortable actually, to the point where they walk around like they owned the place. The place was actually owned by an elderly couple. These macho acting goons were quite friendly with them. The year before they had painted the playground for them for free, so the elderly couple loved these guys. My father saw these men around last time, but he didn't have to deal with them or worry much because their campgrounds were situated far apart. This time, unfortunately, we were placed quite close to them, with only one empty campsite separating us. We were surrounded by other empty campsites too. But about 30 feet away, there was also a middle-aged couple camping out. Here's where the story starts. We arrived and set up our camp. I remember observing those men across from us. My father waved a friendly hello to them, and they waved back. Throughout the day, I played on the playground. By nighttime, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. Meanwhile, those macho goons across the way were partying hard, booze everywhere, and blaring tunes on the radio. We didn't pay much attention or look over their way. We kept to ourselves. Tired yawns, and we crawl into our tent to sleep. but the ruckus was still going on. I was able to fall asleep, but my father was not. He laid there for a few hours and kept checking the time occasionally. It was getting closer to midnight. He wondered if the middle-aged couple nearby was having trouble sleeping over the noise as well. Then, the sound can be heard of vehicles coming down the road. It was an elderly man who owned the place. He stops and lets the men know that there's been a noise complaint. The men apologize profusely and say that they'll be settling in to go to sleep soon, and the owner leaves. They immediately start cursing and throwing things around their campsite as soon as the owner was out of sight. They were offended that someone reported them. "Who do you think did it?" one of them asks. "Well, it's either the guy with the little girl next to us or the other couple over there." The other guy responds, "I didn't see any of them leave their car to go to the front desk, so one of these people must have had a cell phone." This was 1997 or 1998, so cell phones weren't common back then. These men began to try to figure out who owns the cell phone. They weren't trying very hard to speak in a hushed tone because my father could hear everything. "I bet it's that asshole in the Cadillac who owns the cell phone. I'm going over there," one of them says. They're talking about my father. He does not have a cell phone though. The feeling of pure fear came over him. He has no idea what's going to happen and needs to think fast. The sound of stumbling footsteps comes right up inches away from our tent. What to do? My dad thought of making a noise, any noise. He grabbed a soda can next to him and flicked the top open with his fingers. The guy's startled and takes a step backwards. He then scurries away back to his drunken buddies. They are now whispering amongst themselves. He can't pick up on what they were saying, but catches the part of them saying they're going to try again later. He wonders if he heard that right. What the hell are these guys trying to do? There's no way my father is going to fall asleep now. In fact, he's not feeling tired at all. Man, with his daughter, feeling helpless, only a soda can and flashlight to protect us. My dad lays frozen, listening and listening, hoping these guys will give up and just sleep off the drunken craziness. A short time passes, and he hears footsteps coming again. Their campfire was so bright that it casts a shadow onto our tent. He can literally see the shadow of the man coming towards us. The man doesn't get too close this time because, again, he stops at the noise coming from our tent. My dad unzips his sleeping bag in a panic, ready to defend and protect us in case the man was trying to come into our tent. The man does not move anywhere. He's just standing out there watching us. My dad remembered the lighter in his pocket. He took it out, and from underneath the blanket he flickered the switch on. He was hoping to mimic the sound of a gun getting ready. I don't think it worked, but the man eventually turned around to go back to his campsite. "You won't believe this. They're still awake." "What the fuck?" they all sputter amongst themselves. Maybe, just maybe, being around 2:30 now, they will finally go to sleep. Nope. At this point, I'm still asleep, but I'm tossing and turning a lot. My feet slapped against the side of the tent a couple of times. The footsteps are approaching us again, while I brush my feet against the side of the tent. "Ugh," the man says with a sigh. He starts to walk away, but not to his campsite. He's walking towards the road, walks a few feet and stops, and screams on the top of his lungs, "If I find out who reported us, I will kill you. You hear me? I will kill you." Everything is still now. Only sounds that can be heard is the crackling of the campfire and occasionally chatter amongst the men. Then, finally, the sound of their trailer door shutting at 5 a.m. They're asleep. My dad lays there, trying to process everything that has happened. By 6 a.m. he wakes me up and we pack up and get out of there. I remember him rushing me, and I was confused. My dad said he's never going camping there again. That statement is still true. He's never been camping there since. I have many questions though. What did they want? Why did they need us to be asleep to sneak up on us? Did they want to harm my dad and myself? Did they want to steal a cell phone we never had? I guess we'll never know, but it's scary to think about. And I know, my father should have talked to the owners and made a police report too. I'm not sure if that crossed his mind in those moments, I assumed a sleepless night and state of mind. He just wanted to get away, far away, and back into the comfort of his own home. Back in 2011, I was with a circle of friends that made it a tradition to go camping at a certain spot every May long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area right on the edge of a large lake and was located on government land. The lake itself had a dam on it, so during May long, the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spots themselves were spaced far enough apart that you had your own privacy, but not far enough that you wouldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with a campsite below us and one above us. During the second day, the people staying in the site below us had moved in. We didn't think much of it and continued drinking throughout the day into the night. At about midnight, the people in the campsite below us were really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder, so our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face and came back to inform us that he was 90% sure that they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't relaxed, and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired and decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben, and one couple, Lily and Derek, that were visiting another campsite we had made friends with that day. I could hear that campsite below still blasting their music and partying pretty hard. I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time I was jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat a blur. All I know is I sat straight up as soon as I heard screaming and yelling coming from outside the tent. I quickly ran outside to find our campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest, and people were running around screaming, "Call 911." I was quickly informed what happened. Apparently not long after I went to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided they weren't finished talking to Ben. They had encountered Lily and Derek walking back. Now Derek and Ben are about the same height and have similar color hair, so they assumed that Derek was Ben and hit both him and Lily in the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the campfire when 2 or 3 huge guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One had a paring knife and the other one had a butcher knife in their hands. Ben saw the knives and got up to talk to them, and had barely spoken a word when the guy with a paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. Some people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming up and came down to help. One of the guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance were over half an hour away. This is when I came out of the tent. Tim bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of their car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until the ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to the campsite, and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time had gotten into his car and drove the entire distance, flagging down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car, as they had released a canine searching to hunt down the people who had stabbed my friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the 2 men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed and had gotten stuck in a muddy section. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, although Tim lost a lot of blood and took several weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs and possibly a concussion, but I can't recall. It was definitely the scariest thing I've ever experienced. A few of us had to testify against them in court. So this is different from your usual stories, but I think it applies. I was a creep in this situation a while back. Me and several friends decided to go camping. I had to work during the day, so everything was set up by the time I arrived at 9 p.m. I started to drink heavily to catch up. After a few hours, we started to run out of firewood and had a competition to see who could get the most. I headed off away from the group and found some leftover logs. Back at the site, there was nobody there, so I started splitting the wood with an axe and having a good time. All of a sudden, a young couple comes out of their tent with the most horrified expression I've ever seen. This is when it hits me. I was at the wrong campsite. From their perspective, it must have been terrifying, seeing a random stranger laughing while swinging an axe around their campsite. I apologized and quickly got out of there. Let me start by saying, I was a 19-year-old female at this time. Still female, of course, just a little bit older. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I come home from college, we would load up a cooler of beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends would ever want to go, so I suffered from withdrawals from camping. One day the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear. I hopped in the car I borrowed from a buddy and drove to a spot in a secluded yet safe distance from civilization. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but the creepy feeling is also somewhat a plus for me. It's the same reason people read these stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make up a little camp and get a fire going. I hadn't brought much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard a twig crush over my right. Then I see a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with an armful of wood that I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside of the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling a stick I had been messing with. Around 1 a.m., I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars. Another reason why I like camping, I can act however I want, so I passed out pretty quickly. About 2 a.m. I start hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself, it's just a deer or some other animal. Most likely a raccoon because I possibly left food out. I'm still on guard though. About 30 minutes of sleeping, with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed, with my K-bar in hand. I desperately wanted to thrust a knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was just some of my buddies from my frat joking with me. And then, as steadily as it began, it stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure, because daylight would be coming in about 2 to 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to sleep. All of a sudden at 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on, so that if anything happened, I would be ready. After staying up and keeping alert for a little while, I hear my friend's car alarm blaring. I freak the hell out and run out of the tent. I got 2 steps out before something grabs me around the mouth. I open my mouth and scream, but instead the person's finger slips between my teeth. I heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I clamped down. And there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, but his finger popped off. He screamed and pulled his hand away, with a missing digit falling on the ground. He took off running to the hill I was camping on and took off in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little scrawny girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel-toed boots. I also had blood that oozed down my lip from the finger, but because I had also managed to take a pretty big chunk out of my lip as well, I told them what happened, and they called the police and got me some real clothing, and the man of the house made me a whiskey and coke. When the cops got there, they checked it out. They brought me back to my friend's car, and what I saw just made me more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire. The finger was also gone, suggesting he had came back. The kicker is, they never caught the guy, so somewhere out there's a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and couple kids, and he's missing his right pinky. My friends and I decided to go camping one spring. We had planned a week in advance, and as the day got closer, the weather got worse. It was cold and gray, unheard of for Arkansas. The night finally came along with yet another cold front. It was in the 30s, but we had dressed warm and stocked up on whiskey and beer. The plan was to hit the spot my buddy knew, which was barely accessible with his 4x4. We wanted to really camp, none of those designated sites for families and seniors in RVs, so we aimed away from civilization, which was only made up by a single stoplight and a couple hundred people, and we drove into the woods. After 30 minutes of bone-rattling dips across the dry creek beds and detours around trees, it started to rain. By the time we found camp, it had turned into hail. The spot was marked by an ancient dirt road a few hundred feet along a rotting carcass of a VW bug. The night was spent passing the bottle around, hoping we would figure out our tents before we got too drunk. Eventually we did, and managed to start a fire with diesel. At this point the hail stopped. The empty whiskey bottle lay broken in the fire, and we had a decent pile of empties going. We drank, we played cards, we passed out in our tents. The next morning I gradually regained consciousness to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. It was what looked to have been a station wagon, stripped and rust covered, dragging the VW with a chain. The VW had been there for so long that the floor had rotted out and roots tied it to the forest floor. They laid scatter in wake of the wagon. A woman was driving, a man beside her, and 3 shirtless kids sat in the back where there used to be seats. The man stared out the window, away from us the entire time. The children had dirt smeared on their face, which illuminated their glassy 1,000-yard stares. It's a look of crushing poverty, and you've probably only seen it in pictures. It exists in war-torn countries, the projects in inner cities, and the deep south. So deep that the old gas stations back in town, a place you'd probably jokingly hum the Deliverance theme. That was the city to these people. She spoke in a deep nicotine and whiskey-soaked drawl. Y'all come to the city to do some camping? Well, reckon that's fine. Long as you ain't doing no drugs. You ain't doing drugs, are ya? We weren't. Just drinking then. Hell, I like a drink now and again. That's fine, just fine. Wanna know how I know you was here? Have you seen those black helicopters flying around? Them some boys that work for me, see? This is my land, and they told me. Can't be too careful. Figured I'd check it out. She started laughing, mucus bubbling up to wet her dry cackle. The man stared out at nothing. One of the children put both hands on the window and gazed through us. His mouth hung open, and spit cut the line through the filth on the glass. He probably was 10 years old. Y'all know Bethany? We didn't. Ha! Everyone knows old Beth. Y'all go to church? I lied. Good. Ain't no time for those who don't fear God. Why don't you come to church tomorrow? You can meet Bethany. It's just over the hill. She sure do like to meet y'all. They all would. We assured her we would. She drove away into the trees, slowly dragging the VW. As soon as she left, we looked over at each other and started laughing. It was just nerves. There wasn't anything funny about it. We all have remnants of primitive warning system for danger. It's been eroded by living safe and civilized, but every once in a while it goes off, and you obey it without a question. Something was wrong. It started before she spoke. When I looked into her eyes, something is wrong. The kids, the man, her laugh, something is wrong. Eventually we hiked up the hill and could see for a mile. There was nothing, no buildings, no clearings, just forest. We cut the trip short, packed up, and left before noon. Hello, this is Bad Vibes. If you made it this far in the video, thank you very much. That last story, doing the accents of the lady was awful, and it probably sucked. I want to thank Swamp Dweller and Fear Crawler again for helping me out on this video. And thank you for all the new subs. I hope you enjoyed it. Till next time. Why don't you come to church tomorrow?